Okay, so just to kind of catch up from last time, right, a review, we talked about a couple of things like bone remodeling and all the factors that affected it. We talked about aging, we talked about repair. So in no particular order, like think of the repair process here, right? When we're talking about how dynamic a tissue bone was, right? How it can go over those steps like that from being a full breakage, right? And going through those steps where it fully fixed itself, right? Because it's just dynamic like that, right? Unlike things like cartilage and tendons, when you get damages in your cartilage and tendons, it was very slow to repair, at least, once you're mature, right? After this, you get damage here and you get build up, you get your fixing isn't as good as new, whereas with bone, because you have this really good blood supply and you also have cell types, which sort of facilitate this repair, right? And something that bone is doing anyway all the time, right? Repairing itself, modeling it, reacting to stress, right? That's why bone is so, it's so robust at repairing itself. Whereas cartilage, avascular, the cells are kind of inert. And when you get damage in your cartilage and your tendons, right, you tend to get like scar buildup. It's just never quite as good. Right? So the other thing, bone remodeling, right? Your bone is responding to your everyday stresses that you're put on it, right? And it's going to do that by this remodeling process where you're removing bone and adding bone where, removing bone where you don't need it, adding bone where you needed it, as well as all the internal trabecular structure, right? That was changing to respond best to this sort of stress, right? And we also talked about how, these processes, your bone, which you've been working hard your whole life, gives up and then slowly kind of gets degraded, right? You start to get this porous bone after a while. And this is all of this has to do with A, the vascularity of bone, and two, those cell types, right? Osteoblasts making new bone, osteoclasts breaking down bone, right? So today we're going to really kind of focus on this osteoblast thing because we're going to be building bone starting from development. So first, here's a couple of conditions that are kind of relevant. This person has this genetic fibroplasia ossificans, progressiva. I don't know, progressiva. It's this word right here. And what I think looks like happens here is, either the fascia around the muscles or within the, the connective tissue within the muscle starts to become ossified. That is, it starts to turn to bone tissue, right? And so that, their whole kind of skeleton, all that was around their muscles and tendons and everything starts to become bone, right? Through this particular type of disease. It's a very rare thing, but the fact that you have one tissue, this connective tissue, like dense, regular connective tissue, that's actually turning to bone, right? Tells you kind of how this, the possibilities here of how one tissue could turn into another one. And then when we're talking about bone growth, right? You might have heard of gigantism or dwarfism. This is all pituitary gland stuff. Too much GH, growth hormone, remember? That was promoting growth in muscle and bones and stuff. And in these conditions, right, there's either too much or too little, right? And then there's a couple other ones over here that we'll talk about at the end, which we'll understand a little better. Marfan syndrome, achondroplasia, right? In this case, the Marfan syndrome, you get this really, really tall, thin, long-limbed person, right? Whereas if you looked at their trunk, it wouldn't be that abnormal, right? Same thing, this achondroplasia. Achondroplasia, this is twins. One of them had this condition, right? If you measured their trunks and their head size and everything, right, that would be, from here, these would be about the same. Their trunks, would be about the same as well. But their limbs, right, just like in the opposite of this case, their limbs are much shorter, right? And this is also going to be relevant to what we're talking about today, right? So these are all, particular conditions, but today we're going to be talking about how a tissue becomes actually bone tissue, right? How you go from a very soft baby, right, full of nothing but soft tissue, right, into your internal skeleton, right? And there's going to be two basic processes for this. One is called endochondral ossification, in which the stem cells, your embryonic stem cells, first turn into chondroblasts, and they form this sort of model of your bones. And then that model is replaced by bone tissue, or these stem cells turn right into osteoblasts and form mostly your plates of your skull over here, right? These non-weight bearing sort of bones right there. Right, so these are the two processes, endochondral, right? And when you see the word chondro, remember, you're thinking cartilage, right? So chondroblasts, endochondral bone formation. Then membranous is going to be between two membranes, right? So for this, we want to imagine this big, or this a fetus right here. You can see the little bones over here, right? And this is the baby head with the baby brain inside of it. And then, at some point, instead of having this soft tissue surrounding the brain, you'll start to get these little plates, right, of starting to become ossified. Maybe you'll have one here. Maybe you'll have one here. Maybe you'll have one here, right? And the tissue over here, like the dermal sort of thing, if you remember the dermis of the skin, right? You can imagine that just starts to become ossified. And then this will grow out. And grow out more and more until they start reaching out to each other, right? And touching each other, right? So this will be all happening in your head, right? That soft tissue will start to become bone tissue. Right? Just like this picture right here. The soft baby head starts to get these bone spicules and starts to turn into bone, which is going to form all your bone, your skull bones, right? Until when you're a little before you're born here, right? These big plates are growing out. They're growing out. There's still this blue stuff here. That's the remnant of the fibrous tissue, right? That's going to be where the sutures are, right? They're going to eventually just form that dense, fibrous connective tissue that itself is going to be ossified, that make up those sutures, right? But when you're born, you still have a little bit of this left, so your brain has a little room to grow. So here's your adult skull, right? Remember, a bone, any bone has a periosteum covering here on the both sides, right, on your outside, and then this is where your skin would be. And then over here, you'd also have periosteum on the inside, right? And you have other tissue layers under here. So surrounding the bone, you have periosteum, and then you'll have compact bone and spongy bone, right? So this is your adult bone. And think of this periosteum for a minute as sort of, the last bits of, if this whole thing was filled with more of a periosteum-like thing, and then this just became bone over here, right? So this is what happens, right? Here's your baby head. There's the skin. You got, your connective tissue, your fat layer, but at some point over here, this was some kind of mesenchymal tissue, right? Embryonic stem cell tissue, right over here. And then within this region right here, you'd start to get this sheet of condensing mesenchyme tissue that's going to form the bone, right? And then these two areas around it, right, could stay fibrous connective tissue and become the periosteum. So it's going to develop between these layers of this fibrous membrane, right? And again, we're going to see that when a baby's born, they got these soft spots on their head called fontanelles. And you don't have to know the details of the intramembranous, any of this stuff here, but just in case you're wondering, right, you have these mesenchyme cells. They turn into osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts do what osteoblasts do and start secreting bone matrix. Right? And so as they secrete bone matrix, they're going to surround themselves with bone matrix and kind of separate themselves out from the rest of them. So you have this kind of center of bone, right? And then those osteoblasts that are isolating themselves with the so-called osteoid, right? The newly formed bony matrix. And then it's been calcified over here, and then those osteoblasts will become osteocytes, right, within a lacuna, right? So here's what you want to know, the bullet points here. Mesenchyme tissue is going to condense. The mesenchyme cells are going to change into osteoblasts, which do what osteoblasts do. They secrete bone matrix, which then becomes calcified, right? Calcium phosphate and all that. And then, you get these ossification centers that grow out, and they form spongy bone, and then through a complex process forms compact bone. And then these are often called, this is why they're called kind of dermal bones or membrane bones, because they kind of form from this sort of dermal layer. And these will be your skull, some of your face, only a few within the body, the clavicle, or at least part of your clavicle, and then actually your patella. If you remember the patella, well, I didn't really talk about this, did I? But your patella forms in between your ligaments and tendons, right? That attach your muscles and two bones together. And they actually, bone forms within those tendons right there to make that little patella. All right, so this is intramembranous ossification, and there's just those couple examples where that's going to grow, right? So on your skull, over here, you got this intramembranous ossification. And then for the rest of your body, for the most part, it's going to be this other process called endochondral ossification. So going back to a repair for a second, remember that there was a phase right here. You had that hematoma right over there, and then there was a phase where all the repair cells, some of which will be mesenchyme cells, instead of going right to forming bone, they form this cartilage, this soft callus over here, right, as an intermediate step in between repairing that. Because cartilage, right, while it's growing, while it's active, actually grows very fast. Right? It grows very fast over there. And then what happened here was the cartilage died off and was replaced by bone, right? So that could happen throughout your entire life. That's just a general process, right? So endochondral ossification, right? In this case, the early skeleton is going to start with a hyaline cartilage, right? And that cartilage is going to gradually be replaced by the bone, right? So you don't have to know this in particular, but here's a cross section of a developing embryo. And here's the embryonic nervous system, the neural tube, the brain, basically. Here's the embryonic vertebral column. Here's your embryonic trunk muscles. And then here's this budding limb over here. And you could see in the middle of all this would be embryonic connective tissue. You start to get these condensing chondrocyte precursors over here growing along lengthwise along the limb right there. And then surrounding them, you'll start to get what are called tendon primordia, like connective tissue stuff that will form around it. You can also see the muscles going on, right? So your limb's going to grow out in this very simple way so that all these are your bone and your connective tissue and muscles are all growing out together, right? We want to focus on this right here, on these red ones right over here, these chondrocyte precursors, these cells that are going to become chondrocytes. So you're going to start with these chondrocytes, right? This cartilage cells, and they're going to start condensing similar to how the mesenchyme cells condensed. And along the length, right, of that limb, they'll start to form these bone-like structures over here, right? Form these cartilage models. As these proliferate very fast, right? So the whole process, right, are going to be forming most of your long bones, especially in your appendages, right? This cartilage model is going to be formed first, right? And then the bone is going to replace that cartilage over time. It's not as if these blue cells here turn into bone cells. What we'll see is that they die off and then bone cells move in to replace them, using this sort of template right here. And so we'll walk kind of through the steps of how this occurs. right? But in a summary, you're going to start off with that cartilage. It's going to be replaced by bone at a certain process right here. And then what you're going to be left with here is that articular cartilage on each side, right? So that's going to be a remnant of this whole process, as we'll see. All right, so this first step over here, you have the rubber dog bone. Over here, all cartilage. Now, as this cartilage starts to grow, the cartilage inside, they start to slow down because they start to get choked off. They don't have as much oxygen as they did when it was a smaller piece. Right? So they're kind of more surrounded by cartilage, is less in the periosteum. So what happens is they start to die off, right? And the matrix around them starts to calcify. And then these cells die over here, right? Because they become totally choked off. So you'll see this term apoptosis, right? That's just programmed cell death, right? They just say, okay, we're going to die, right? And so as they start dying off within this rubber dog bone, you're left with this cavity inside here, this kind of hole of dead cartilage. Around the outside over here, while that's happening, while they start growing big, you start to get these periosteum starts to kind of develop around the bone, which is going to include those blasts, right, which is in the cellular layer of that. So you're going to start to get this sort of so-called bone collar around this shaft over here, the diaphysis. So you get osteogenic, right? You start to get a little bone growth, the bone cells over here. You still have cartilage in this case. But bone cells, there are these bone cells type weighting, there's vascular weighting. When the cartilage is alive, it actually sends out signals to repel vascularization. And so cartilage actually sends out signals to kind of repel that growth. Right? So as far as that was concerned, you still have all these cartilage cells that are repelling the blood vessel growth. But as this cavity starts to form, all those cells die, the blood vessels start to be able to penetrate inside this space right here, right? There's no more inhibition, right? And as this blood vessel starts penetrating the space, your osteoblasts are able to move in. Right? And so as the osteoblasts will move in here, they start to do their thing, right? They start to secrete bone matrix and start making this inside of this bone. All right, so this whole first part is called an ossification center. Ossification meaning center, meaning it's in the center. Now you're starting to get this bone growth within the rubber cartilage model right here. Not rubber, you know what I mean, the cartilage model. So that's your primary. And right, these cells are moving in here. I mean, the blood vessels are moving in, the cells are in, they start to form the bony matrix on the outside, right? This is allowing the blood vessels to move in. So the blood vessels are moving in, and this over here, you start to get the formation osteoclasts start building out this medullary cavity. Remember, this is where the bone marrow, a lot of the bone marrow is going to be, right? So this is important. Why it's important is, bone obviously is your place where your bone marrow, so you're going to need a space for that. And you're not going to need this for strength. All right, so you start to get this big area. Bone is being built on the sides right here. And it's also going to start to be built around near the epiphysis over here, right? And as this is all happening, right, there's going to be growth lengthwise and widthwise, right? Widthwise is going to be called appositional. Elongation is called interstitial, and we're going to go over those processes in more detail in a minute, but let's just walk through the whole process. At this point, you got the shaft almost entirely of bone, and the epiphyses are still made of cartilage. The outer ring is all that. So at this point, right, you had that primary ossification center, then you had the epiphyseal ends was all made of cartilage still, and then you start to get these secondary ossification centers on the proximal and distal epiphysis, right? Same thing is going to happen, right? You get a cavity, a bunch of dead cartilage cells, blood vessels move in, bone cells move in after and start building bone in the middle right here. Right? So this whole thing is happening. You start to get that bone collar, right? Cells move in and start making this, right? So it's primary ossification, secondary ossifications on the ends right there. That's everything we talked about with this is happening over here now. And now you're left with this ring of cartilage, right, around the ends over here, and then down at what you call the metaphysis, right, in between the epiphysis and the shaft over here. All right. The next step, not so much a step, but it is happening at the time, right? This epiphyseal growth that is right around this area over here where this leftover piece of cartilage is. This is where growth is going to occur. I'm going to go over this a little separately, so we're going to put a pin in that for a minute. Because at some point that growth lengthwise will stop, and all that's left over there, that growth place, is this so-called epiphyseal line and the articular cartilage. Okay. Everything else has been replaced by bone at this point. Right. So that's the whole steps of how this happens. But I want to go in a little more detail about this interstitial growth, that is growth at that epiphyseal plate